I call this meeting to order. I don't have an agenda today, so I'm going to speculate on what I'm doing. Sorry. Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk. So confirmation of agenda, nothing to add today because I think we got more than we can handle already. Any disclosure of pecuniary interest, general nature thereof?
No.
No.
Adoption of the minutes from the last committee of the whole meeting.
Moved by Councillor Lewis, second by Deputy Mayor Gardner, that the minutes of the Committee of the Whole held on April 15th, 2020 of the 7th Council of the Corporation of Municipality of South Dundas be adopted as circulated.
You've all heard the motion. Sounds like we're approving it. Okay. In favor, opposed, thank you. Sorry we're a bit scattered today, but it's been a busy morning and it's going to be a busy afternoon. Okay, so discussion items today, and fairly in-depth and topical probably and we'll start with the draft property standards bylaw discussion, and I'll turn it over to Nicole to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. Today before you we have a draft property standards bylaw that we're bringing forward for the entire municipality of South Dundas. Our current property standards bylaws are very outdated and only reflect the town of Morrisburg and the village of Iroquois. Morrisburg's property standards bylaw was drafted in 1986 and Iroquois in 1979. So we've been working with Mally McGregor and Warren Leroy from Alt to draft this new property standards bylaw. We can answer any questions that you have at any time.
Okay. No more description, no more nothing? Okay. I have read it. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Nicole, when you look at the new bylaw, are there elements since you've been here that weren't working for you? And that's the reason why the bylaw rejig. I hear the datedness, but you know, are there more tools? Which, if you could highlight the tools that were missing that you now have on this bylaw, that would probably be good information.
Yes, for sure. So our previous bylaws were just restricted to the villages themselves.
Yep.
And as you're aware, our municipality is quite large, so we
Yep.
want to make sure that every property in the municipality is encompassed within the property standards bylaw. And some changes that have been made are the actual property standards related to the building code.
Okay.
So if there's derelict buildings that are falling apart, we want to make sure that those are addressed and keep the property owners and the public safe.
Okay. So with the change, sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead.
With the changes in the new bylaw, and I get it's not handy to just have one bylaw for the urban areas. Will this new bylaw fill in the spaces on some of the property files that you've been dealing with that have been difficult to move forward?
Do you mind if I jump in for a second here, Nicole? Can you hear me all right?
Yes,
Yes.
We can hear you. Go ahead, Mally.
Okay,
and
great.
welcome.
Nicole's given you a good summary there. Another thing that I'd like to add, the Building Code Act was amended in 2015, I believe, and so it actually updated the requirements for property bylaws, for property standards bylaws, and so there's some argument that the old ones that you have aren't even enforceable anymore. Like, I wouldn't want to have to go to court and try and argue about those ones because a lawyer that knew what they were doing could probably get them thrown out. So you basically were functioning without property standards bylaws, which was part of the reason that we wanted to do this. And Nicole and I, the building department generally, have been working on a few properties. You're probably familiar with the Allison House. So we've got an ongoing prosecution which has been delayed by COVID, but that's an example of one where it would have been easier and the municipality would have had more options about how to address those issues if there were a property standards bylaw in place. Because there wasn't, our only options for prosecuting were under the building code, which has fewer prosecution options and higher standards to prove. So under a new property standards bylaw, there are probably 50 different things we could have charged that in relation to that particular property. And our scope is a lot narrower under the Building Code Act. So this gives the municipality more, and I think more effective options for dealing with problem properties. Another thing that we're proposing doing is having some set fines. So if this bylaw is approved, then we can apply to the Regional Chief Justice in Ottawa and have some fines set, which a lot of municipalities do, which means that if they don't argue about it, there's an automatic fine that can be levied against the property, which also simplifies the process. So overall, I think it's giving the municipality better options in terms of dealing with problem properties, and it's simplifying some of the options for ticketing people and for getting it dealt with. So, I mean, people, if they still want to go to court and argue about it, that's still an option, and there's no way around that. But I do think it'll make the odds of actually getting convictions on some of these properties higher, and the process is better.
Perfect, thank you. That was kind of where the question was, right? The public likes to know why we do things, and there has been some public feedback as to why it's taken so long. So that's excellent. That clears it up why the process is and why we've got a new set. So thank you.
All right, Councilor Lewis.
I have no questions, but now that that the young lady has explained it, it makes more sense to me now. I understand it a lot better. And I thank you for that. And I have no questions right now.
Okay. So I will say this is an extremely thorough document. And having said that, in my opinion, it's too thorough. Because 95% of the homes and residents in South Dundas will be not in compliance with this. Like it's way too, like it's so detailed. Like my fence at my property leans a bit. My neighbor complains, you're going to have to go out. What are you going to do? It's leaning. It's not in repair. We're going to have a whole new department. If we put this through, their phones will never stop ringing, because I can complain about anything and everything. And so is that reasonable? Am I looking at it the wrong way? Because it's that fussy. And I understand that you want to, I understand from a legal point of view, it makes logical sense. But from a practicality point of view, I don't know if we can work with it.
Yeah, fair enough, and I can speak to that. So most municipalities that have these, they are pretty detailed. A lot of the provisions match what we have under the building code, so they're things that most properties are legally required to do anyway, and it's true. Nicole could speak to this. Certainly most properties would have something that would be in violation. It can be a complaints-driven system, so a lot of prosecutions stem from the property where you keep hearing neighbors complaining about it. That doesn't necessarily obligate the municipality to prosecute. There's discretion in deciding which cases to pursue and which not to pursue. That being said, if there were certain provisions that you were concerned were going to be a huge problem, then we could certainly look at them. But generally, most municipalities have property standards bylaws in place. Most of them tend to be quite detailed, and that doesn't mean that every time there's a tiny infraction, it'll lead to a prosecution. It is a balancing act, because you're right, you don't want to spend all day, every day dealing with any complaint that anyone may have. That doesn't tend to happen, but there is discretion. You don't have to pursue everything, but again, if you're concerned about particular provisions, we can always look at them.
I don't know
if you want to address that at all, Nicole.
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Mayor and Melly. So we do receive complaints on our complaint system policy where people complain, and we have to investigate each one specifically. So under the Property Standards Bylaw and the Building Code Act, we, as Chief Building Official and the Building officials under me and the bylaw enforcement. We do have the discretion to make that decision as to whether or not there's contraventions of our current property standards bylaw. Obviously, the complaints have to be valid, and we're seeing more often that it's just a dispute between neighbors rather than an actual property standards complaint.
I agree wholeheartedly, but that's half the problem, because even the one in Williamsburg, I'm starting to gather more information just through people that know what's going on, and I'm hearing both sides of the story now, and it makes you rethink of all the what we're hearing instead of just listening to, you know, one side of the story. And, you know, if I take this document and start driving around Morrisburg, I'll guarantee you I can get 50% of, without even going in their house, 50% will not match this bylaw. So that's the challenge I have. And I know we have more responsibility now that the province has downloaded us looking after property standards on tenancy act situations. In fact, I was delayed by somebody who called me concerning an issue on property standards and landlords, and it's unfortunate we're lined up in that job. I do remember in the past when it wasn't our responsibility, it still landed to be our responsibility. We still get the call, or I get the call as mayor, or your former CBO would get the call and they say, not our problem, but and then they'll say, well, it should be your problem, and now it is. But, you know, that's my concerns. It's just a little too fussy, but I don't know where you can stop the fussiness, and if I still think it's going to generate a lot of work. I believe that if people see this, they'll use it as a tool to deal with small complaints, big complaints, any complaint, especially tenants, because tenants, landlords always tend to be at button heads at times, you know, and all it takes is some little thing. Oh, I seen a little, you know, insect in the corner, I'm going to complain, and or, you know, the toilet's not working right, I'm going to complain. And some are rightly so. They should be complaints that have to be followed up. I don't disagree, and I know that the one property on Park is a big headache and has been a headache for a long time. I actually have an abandoned house I should demolish, but it's in the country and nobody, you know, it's not bothering anybody. But if someone comes along and says, well, the house should be, something happened to it, well, then I will make something happen. It'll be pretty fast. But I mean, you know, I don't know, it's going to be a challenge. I think it's going to be a challenge. That's my belief from just, that was my initial gut feeling. Yes, Deputy Mayor Gardner.
I actually thought that when I read it. I went through and I was like, wow. So if someone's toilet's broken or their eavesdrop has some whatever, it's like the whole process. Lots of these laws are like that. I mean, if you look at the HTA, for example, I mean, if a police officer wanted to, when they pull you over for speeding, they'd probably give you 20 different tickets, right? If your lights aren't cleaned and all this stuff. But I do hate building, and this will add to it, building a community where it is that fussiness, that complaint-driven neighbor against neighbor, and effectively we're handing them a tool that says, if you don't like the color of the socks that your neighbor's wearing, just look at their house really closely, and then you can get all up in their business. And when I think of property standards and you know, building codes and stuff, I think safety first. That's my, you know, that's the real important part, is the safety of the community. And I'd like it to have some bite so you can address with the buildings that it is definitely a safety concern. And keep in mind, I mean, since I've rented or whatever, I've always maintained, you know, my property, mowed my grass, did whatever. But I don't really want to set up so we have this neighbor for neighbor battle. And we're not in the 1970s, so it's not good enough to just tell them they can battle it out in the street. For me, the safety concerns, like the elements of safety that you need to enforce, so kids or whatever aren't impacted, or tenants or whatever, that to me is that. And then there is definitely the property value thing. If you've invested in a property and your neighbors are if there's rats or whatever, but again, that would be safety, right? So for me, the safety is the one that should really have the teeth in this document. The nitpicky, nitty gritty, I'm going to call you up because I saw drops of rain coming from the corner of my neighbor's eaves trough. Yeah.
So, you've heard our concerns. How would you address them? Like, I'm not saying this is not a good bylaw, but and Deputy Mayor Gardner's right. I drive a large truck at times, and the fear of having MTO coming across and seeing a little dirty light and saying, well, we're going to check you from stem to stern, even if everything's good, is going to cause you grief. I think.
Yeah, I used to prosecute for the MTO, so I'm very familiar with those regulations, and yeah, there are a lot of them. It's hard to pass them all.
That's right. So how do we?
I hear your concerns. I think knowing that the building department that we have use their discretion well to begin with, so this really isn't designed to have neighbors complain. Like that eaves trough dripping is a good example. We have to keep in mind that if we're actually going to go to court for any of these, my recommendation as a lawyer is typically to do it for those cases where, for example, there's a serious safety issue, or there's an issue because you've got a beautiful street of houses and then you've got one house that's just an absolute wreck, which is both safety and visually all kinds of problems. The problem with not having it or not having some details is that if we're prosecuting under the general provisions that the Building Code Act gives us, we have to meet broader tests in terms of, okay, we have to actually prove that this is unsafe, which is a more specific and harder to prove legal test. Whereas if what we have to prove is there's a hole in the deck, or the windows actually don't have windows anymore, or there's a leak in the roof, like those actually are all potentially serious safety issues for people living there or near the property, and it's easier to be able to deal with it if we can be more specific under the property standards bylaw. I've worked with a number of municipalities with property standards bylaws. It in my experience, it hasn't been a problem of over-prosecution for minor issues, because you don't have an obligation to prosecute every time there's a potential breach of the bylaw. There's always a level of discretion, and as a prosecutor, I always have to look to see whether or not we actually think we're going to get a conviction, and that. One of those is the severity of the issue. So like a slightly leaning fence, I don't want to have to go to court and explain to a justice of the peace why somebody should have to pay a bunch of money to fix that. Like I've got to be able to make a good pitch to court as to why that is something that the court system in the township should be interfering with at all. You could get complaining neighbors. I'm not sure that they're going to be a whole lot more complaining than they already are. I think Nicole could probably speak to this, that if people feel like there's a problem with their neighbors' properties, they're probably already complaining about it. And it's hard for the municipality because if it is something serious, at this point, we're not left with great options for how to prosecute. Whereas if you had a more robust bylaw in place, you'd have better options if that made sense. But you always have to do analysis, and my recommendation would never be to prosecute every single infraction that could come up somewhere. It's the places that have serious problems that we tend to go forward with these. And honestly, in a lot of them, we're able to resolve it before we actually have to get to something like a trial. Just starting that process is often enough to get a landlord or a property owner or whoever it is to fix the problem, which is, again, I always try and encourage settlement if we can in these. But again, if there are certain provisions that you feel are too fussy, or you feel that the municipality doesn't care about because it doesn't reflect a safety issue, and I defer to Nicole on a lot of those questions, then we can certainly narrow down some of those sections if you think some of them are just going to cause problems.
Okay. Deputy Mayor Gardner, and I'll go over you.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is helpful, but I've worked with staff that we've had my staff have had different tools to lay different charges. And one of the things that we've done in different environments is we've had a policy attached to the bylaw. So, or I shouldn't say attached, not formally attached, but so you'd have the policy, because as I've said before, as great as we have, if we don't always have you and you get someone seriously zealous in that position that's going to go, we've seen it before, it can become that. Sometimes if you hire someone that likes to write tickets, it can get a little ridiculous. And I've actually had staff that have crossed the line with the Provincial Offences Act within the parks. I mean, it was ridiculous. You know, they're coming back giving whatever. So how we address those things through policy, through a staff policy where it's a directive, and there's usually a chain that is, and I think you have one now, where you're referring to the chain of complaints and how you deal with the complaints, and then it's kind of a step-by-step basis, whereas the bylaw is for the teeth of the issue if you have a huge issue, but there is a policy and procedure in play formally that staff are aware of that dictates how they deal with a leaning fence. Not specifically, but you know what I mean, a minor complaint. So in my mind, I don't know if you feel that our policy around this with our enforcement officers our bylaw officers has enough explanation in it to just protect our residents from somebody who may come on board that is just completely overzealous and ridiculous because they're energized about being a bylaw officer. So just, you know, that's my thought process, is maybe there should be a policy and procedure, I hate to say it, manual attached to how to deal with this. So we do protect from the overzealous folks that may abuse it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. So the intent of the Building Code Act and property standards bylaws are mainly for life safety of the occupants and the public themselves. My department and my staff typically try to work with those people who are problem properties before we get to the prosecution stage. So the reason we have such a detailed draft before you is when we get to the people that don't absolutely refuse to comply, we have to have a very technical argument before the JP. So
Yep.
And ideally we don't go that route, but we have to have something on paper so we can fight that battle if we need to. I don't disagree with you. We could look at our policies on how we address staffing these type of complaints. To let you know, we do have code of conduct under the Interior Building Code
Yep.
and municipal bylaw offenses officers.
I'm also thinking of protecting our residents from folks sitting around this table. You know, it would be awful, 10 years from now, you've got somebody who's got a grudge and they get elected and they're, you know what I mean? And it does go against our whatever, but I'm not saying that's never happened. So, you know, I think that's my comfort level, where I'm glad to give you some teeth, but I would like an attachment where it's very, very clearly outlined in your staffing policies and procedures how this tool is to be used